I never imagined myself as the type of person who would stand up to authority. I'm not a troublemaker or someone who likes drama. In fact, I've always been the opposite, quiet, practical, and willing to follow rules if it means keeping the peace. That's why, when my husband Daniel and I bought our farm on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, I thought we were stepping into a dream. A small piece of land where we could grow vegetables, raise animals, and give our daughter Lily a taste of country living, while still being close enough to town for convenience. It seemed perfect. The neighborhood itself was beautiful in its own way. Rows of tidy houses with manicured lawns stretched out behind us, but our property sat at the far end of the development, surrounded by trees and open fields. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, had assured us during the purchase process that they supported rural charm alongside their strict guidelines for suburban perfection. At first, everything felt fine. Sure, there were some rules about fence colors and mailbox heights, but nothing too crazy. We figured we could adapt. Then came the bees. It wasn't just about having honey or helping pollinate our garden. Bees represented freedom to me, a chance to create something sustainable, something alive. When I placed the hives near the back of the property, I didn't think twice. What harm could a few buzzing insects do? But apparently, according to Mrs. Hargrove, the head of the HOA, quite a lot. Mrs. Hargrove is one of those people you notice immediately. She walks with purpose, her clipboard always in hand, dressed in clothes so neatly pressed they look uncomfortable. She showed up unannounced one Saturday morning, her lips curved into what might have been intended as a smile, but came across more like a sneer. "Ms. Harper," she began, her tone clipped, "I'm afraid these hives are unauthorized." I blinked at her, confused. "Unauthorized?" "Yes," she said, consulting her clipboard as though it held the answers to life's greatest mysteries. Section 8.3 of the HOA Covenant clearly states that no livestock or agricultural activities may be conducted without prior written approval. "Bees aren't livestock," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm despite the absurdity of the situation. "They are considered agricultural activity," she countered smoothly, her smile tightening further. "You'll need to remove them within 7 days, or we'll consider this a violation." A violation. Just like that, my little project became a potential crime. I wanted to argue, to explain how harmless the bees were, but something in her demeanor told me it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about logic, it was about control. That moment stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, notices started arriving almost daily. Trim the brambles along the fence line. Repaint the barn to match the approved color palette. Take down the wind chimes because they caused noise disturbances. Each letter ended with the same warning: comply or face penalties. Fines piled up quickly, each one adding another layer of frustration. What bothered me most wasn't the money, it was the principal, who gave them the right to dictate every detail of how we lived. Our farm wasn't hurting anyone. If anything, it added character to the neighborhood. Yet here we were, caught in a battle over things as trivial as paint colors and buzzing insects. Daniel tried to convince me to let it go. "Just repaint the barn," he said one evening, rubbing his temples. "Tear down the coop. It's not worth losing everything over." But it was worth it, to me anyway. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about standing up for what mattered. For once, I decided I wouldn't back down. Little did I know, that decision would lead to consequences far greater than I ever imagined. The more I resisted, the tighter the HOA's grip became. It was like living under a microscope, where every move we made was scrutinized and judged. At first, it felt manageable. Annoying, sure, but not unbearable. We paid the fines reluctantly, thinking maybe if we showed some effort, they'd ease up. But instead of backing off, the HOA doubled down. Every week brought new letters, each one more ridiculous than the last. One morning, I found a notice taped to our front door about the unsightly compost pile in the backyard. Unsightly. It was just a small heap of leaves, grass clippings, and kitchen scraps turning into rich soil for the garden. How could something so useful be considered ugly? The next day, another letter arrived complaining about the chickens. Apparently, their coop didn't meet aesthetic standards, whatever that meant. These weren't pets, they were working animals, providing fresh eggs and natural pest control. Still, the HOA demanded we either repaint the coop or get rid of them altogether. Each violation carried a fine, and soon the bills began stacking up. $100 here, $200 there. It added up fast. By the end of the month, we owed over $2,000. For what? Bees, chickens, and a pile of dirt. It felt surreal, like being punished for breathing. Daniel grew quieter with each passing day, his shoulders heavy with stress. He worked longer hours to cover the costs, leaving me to deal with the growing tension alone. Then came the anonymous notes. They appeared overnight, taped to our gatepost or slipped under the door. Short, blunt messages designed to intimidate. Sell now before it's too late, or you'll regret crossing us. There was no signature, no way to trace who left them, but the message was clear: back down, or face the consequences. At first, I tried to ignore them, telling myself they were empty threats. Who would actually act on such nonsense? Surely, no one would dare escalate things further. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes watching me. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now avoided eye contact altogether. Even Karen, who lived next door and used to bring over homemade cookies, stopped speaking to me. When I caught her gaze across the fence one afternoon, she quickly turned away, pretending to prune her roses. It wasn't just the isolation that got to me. It was the fear. Fear of what might happen if I kept pushing back. Fear of losing everything we'd worked so hard for. And yet, deep down, I knew giving in wasn't an option. If I surrendered now, what would stop them from coming after us again tomorrow? Where did it end? Lily noticed the change too. She stopped playing outside as much, retreating to her room to watch cartoons or play video games. One evening, while helping her with homework, she looked up at me with wide eyes and asked, "Mommy, are we going to have to leave?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I forced a smile and reassured her everything would be okay. But inside, I wasn't so sure. Leaving wasn't part of the plan. This farm was supposed to be our forever home, a place where we could grow roots and build memories. Now, it felt like ground zero in a war we hadn't asked to fight. As tensions escalated, I realized this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was personal. The HOA wasn't just trying to enforce guidelines. They were sending a message: comply or suffer the consequences. And when compliance seemed impossible, suffering became inevitable. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the porch staring at the dark outline of the barn. The bees hummed softly in the distance, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. I thought about all the work we'd put into this place, the hours spent tilling soil, fixing fences, and dreaming of a better future. Was it worth it? Could we really win against something so powerful? I didn't know the answer then. But one thing was certain: walking away wasn't an option. Not yet. Because sometimes standing your ground isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself in the process. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind where the world feels eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. I woke up earlier than usual, drawn out of bed by an unfamiliar smell. At first, I thought it was someone burning leaves, a common sight in the neighborhood during autumn. But as I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, my stomach dropped. Thick, black smoke billowed into the sky, twisting and curling like a living thing. The barn was on fire. My heart raced as I ran toward the flames, shouting for Daniel. He stumbled out of the house behind me, his face pale with shock. Together, we stood frozen for a moment, watching the inferno consume everything we'd worked so hard to build. The heat was unbearable, even from 20 feet away, and the crackling sound of wood splitting apart made my chest tighten. Lily appeared at the doorway, her eyes wide with terror, clutching her stuffed bunny. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back inside, away from the danger. Neighbors began to gather, their faces illuminated by the flickering orange glow. Some held phones, recording the chaos, while others whispered among themselves. No one rushed forward to help, not that they could have done much against a blaze like this. Fire trucks arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, but by then it was too late. The barn collapsed in on itself, reduced to a pile of smoldering ash and charred timber. All that remained were fragments of memories. Tools Daniel had spent months restoring, feed sacks stacked neatly along the walls, and shelves lined with jars of honey from last season's harvest. What struck me most wasn't just the destruction. It was the lack of surprise on people's faces. There were no gasps of horror, no tears of sympathy. Instead, there was silence. Blank stares, whispers exchanged behind cupped hands. Even the firefighters seemed distant, focusing more on containing the fire than investigating how it started. When one of them finally approached us, his expression gave nothing away. "We'll need to look into the cause," he said, his voice flat. "Could be electrical, or maybe accelerants were used." Accelerants. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud. Someone had set this fire intentionally. It wasn't an accident. It was a message written in flames. Later that day, investigators confirmed what I already suspected: arson. Whoever did this hadn't bothered to hide their tracks well. Traces of flammable liquid were found near the base of the barn, evidence that pointed squarely to deliberate action. But who? And why? Deep down, I didn't need proof to know the truth. This wasn't random vandalism or some stray spark gone wrong. It was retaliation, a warning shot fired across my bow. After weeks of resisting the HOA's demands, standing firm when everyone else told me to back down, I had become a target. Burning down the barn wasn't just about destroying property, it was about breaking me. For days afterward, I replayed the scene in my mind, searching for answers. Had someone seen the culprit sneaking around our property late at night? Was there security footage from nearby homes that might capture the crime? But every lead felt like chasing shadows. Neighbors clammed up whenever I asked questions, afraid to get involved. Even Karen avoided me completely, pretending not to hear when I called her name over the fence. The emotional toll was worse than the financial loss. Every time I looked at the ruins of the barn, anger bubbled inside me, hot and unrelenting. Someone had crossed a line, and I couldn't let it go unpunished. Yet beneath the anger lay fear, a gnawing uncertainty about what might come next. If they were willing to burn down a barn, what else were they capable of? Daniel tried to reassure me, saying we'd rebuild, find a way to move forward. But his words rang hollow. How do you rebuild trust when your own community turns against you? How do you protect your family when danger lurks in places you once called safe? As the days passed, I realized something important. This fire hadn't just destroyed wood and stone. It had ignited a fire within me, a determination to fight back, no matter the cost. Because sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what you're truly made of. The fire changed everything, but it also gave me clarity. Before, I had been fighting blindly, reacting to each new rule or fine as it came. Now, I knew exactly who I was dealing with and what they were capable of. The HOA wasn't just a group of overzealous neighbors enforcing guidelines. They were bullies willing to go to extremes to get their way. And if I wanted to stand a chance against them, I needed more than anger. I needed evidence. That's when I decided to fight fire with fire. I started small, gathering every document, letter, and notice the HOA had ever sent me. I organized them chronologically, highlighting patterns, the escalating fines, the vague threats, the sudden shift from minor complaints to outright hostility after I refused to remove the bees. Each piece of paper told a story, one that painted the HOA not as protectors of harmony, but as enforcers of control. Next, I reached out to Mr. Thompson, the retired judge who lived at the end of our block. He'd always struck me as sharp and fair-minded, someone who valued justice above all else. When I explained what had happened, the fire, the intimidation, the anonymous notes, he listened quietly, his expression unreadable. By the time I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed deeply. "This isn't just about your property," he said finally. "It's about accountability. If we don't push back now, they'll keep doing this to others." With his help, I filed a lawsuit, not just against the HOA as an organization, but against its individual members, including Mrs. Hargrove. We demanded $600,000 in damages for the loss of the barn, equipment, and potential income from the farm. But money wasn't the only goal. This was about exposing the truth, forcing people to see the HOA for what it really was. As word spread, whispers rippled through the neighborhood. Some residents supported us quietly, slipping anonymous tips about suspicious behavior or offering to testify if needed. Others distanced themselves further, afraid of retaliation. One neighbor claimed she'd overheard Mrs. Hargrove bragging about teaching you a lesson during a board meeting. Another mentioned seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near our property late at night before the fire. Every scrap of information added weight to our case. But digging up evidence wasn't easy. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes captured fragments of activity. A shadowy figure lingering near the fence line. A car speeding away. But nothing definitive enough to point fingers directly. Security guards hired by the HOA stonewalled investigators, claiming they didn't recall anything unusual. Even the arson report left room for doubt, stating only that accelerants had been used without identifying a specific source. Through it all, I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Frustration gnawed at me, especially on days when progress seemed non-existent. Daniel worried constantly, reminding me how much we stood to lose if things went south. What if they countersue? He asked one evening, pacing the kitchen floor. What if we end up bankrupt because of this? His fears weren't unfounded, but I couldn't let them stop me. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was bigger than that. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds felt impossible. Because if I backed down now, what kind of example would I be setting for Lily? For everyone else trapped under the HOA's thumb. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. A former HOA member contacted us anonymously, claiming internal documents existed proving the board had discussed extreme measures to deal with non-compliant homeowners. Another neighbor admitted she'd seen Mrs. Hargrove arguing heatedly with a contractor days before the fire, though she couldn't remember the exact words exchanged. Each revelation strengthened our case, bringing us closer to the truth. Still, doubt lingered in the back of my mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if, despite all our efforts, the HOA walked away unscathed? The thought terrified me, but it also fueled my determination. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal, and I refused to let fear dictate my choices any longer. Because sometimes, the hardest fights are the ones worth winning. The trial felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Dark, unpredictable, and full of tension. Every day in court was a roller coaster of emotions, with moments that made my heart race and others that left me feeling drained. The courtroom itself was an intimidating place, filled with polished wood, stern-faced officials, and rows of spectators whispering behind their hands. I sat at the plaintiff's table alongside Mr. Thompson, clutching my notes so tightly my knuckles turned white. Mrs. Hargrove took the stand early in the proceedings, dressed impeccably in a navy blue suit that screamed authority. Her demeanor was calm, almost robotic, as she answered questions from both sides. When asked about the HOA's policies, she spoke confidently, framing every rule as necessary for maintaining order and property values. But when Mr. Thompson began cross-examining her, cracks started to show. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, leaning forward slightly, his tone polite but probing, "you claim these guidelines exist to protect the community. Yet isn't it true that many of them seem arbitrary? For instance, why prohibit something as harmless as bees?" She hesitated, glancing briefly at her lawyer before replying. Bees are considered agricultural activity, which falls outside the scope of residential living. And what harm do they cause? Mr. Thompson pressed. Do they damage homes, disrupt neighbors, or is it simply because they don't fit your vision of perfection? Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer directly. Instead, she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with the jury. It was subtle, but enough to make people wonder if there was more to the story. Witnesses came and went, each adding fragments to the larger picture. One neighbor testified anonymously, admitting she'd seen Mrs. Hargrove arguing with a contractor days before the fire. Another recounted hearing board members discuss teaching Ms. Harper a lesson during a heated meeting. Even former HOA employees spoke up, describing how the organization prioritized control over cooperation, often targeting homeowners who dared question their authority. Public opinion began to shift as news outlets picked up the story. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, eager to capture sound bites and snapshots of the unfolding drama. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForHarperFarm and #HOABullyExposed. Supporters rallied outside, holding signs that read, "Stand up against tyranny," and "Protect rural living." Strangers approached me after hearings, offering words of encouragement or sharing their own stories of battling oppressive HOAs. Despite the growing support, doubt lingered in my mind. Winning meant proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the HOA, and possibly Mrs. Hargrove herself, was responsible for the arson. Without concrete evidence tying them directly to the crime, the case rested heavily on circumstantial details. Could we convince the jury that the pattern of harassment and intimidation pointed to guilt? Daniel struggled with the stress, working longer hours to keep our finances afloat while trying to shield Lily from the chaos. She noticed, of course. Kids always do, but we tried to reassure her that everything would be okay. Late at night, though, when the house was quiet, I couldn't help replaying worst-case scenarios in my head. What if we lost? What if the HOA walked away untouched, free to continue their reign of fear? Then came the turning point, a piece of evidence we hadn't expected. A local teenager, skateboarding near our property the night of the fire, had recorded a video on his phone without realizing its significance. In the dim footage, a figure could be seen darting away from the barn moments before flames erupted. While the face wasn't clear, the clothing matched descriptions of uniforms worn by contractors hired by the HOA. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to cast serious doubt. As closing arguments approached, I felt a mix of hope and dread. This was it, the final push. Mr. Thompson stood before the jury, his voice steady yet impassioned. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't just about property damage," he said. "It's about accountability, about standing up against abuse of power. If we allow organizations like this HOA to act without consequence, where does it end?" When he finished, the courtroom fell silent. All we could do now was wait, for the jury's verdict, for justice, for closure. And as I sat there, surrounded by uncertainty, one thing became clear. No matter the outcome, I had already won something far greater than money. I had reclaimed my voice. The moment the jury returned to the courtroom, time seemed to slow down. Every shuffle of papers, every creak of a chair, echoed louder than usual. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand, his grip tight but reassuring. Lily sat with us, clutching her stuffed bunny, her wide eyes darting between me and the jury box. The air felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. The foreman stood, his face unreadable as he cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff," he announced, his voice steady but carrying enough weight to silence any lingering whispers in the gallery. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief from the HOA side. My knees nearly buckled beneath me as relief crashed over me like a tidal wave. The verdict wasn't just a win, it was validation. The jury awarded us $600,000 for damages, plus an additional $250,000 in punitive charges for malicious intent. Cheers erupted from our supporters in the gallery, some standing to applaud. Strangers who had followed the case online hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Even Mr. Thompson allowed himself a rare smile, patting me on the shoulder as he muttered, "Well done." But not everyone shared in the celebration. Mrs. Hargrove sat frozen at the defendant's table, her face pale and expressionless. Her lawyer whispered urgently into her ear, but she didn't respond. For the first time, she looked less like the untouchable enforcer of rules, and more like someone who had been caught red-handed. As the judge banged his gavel to restore order, I couldn't help but notice how small she seemed now. Deflated, almost human. The aftermath hit quickly. Within days, the HOA dissolved under the weight of scandal and public outrage. Board members resigned one by one, retreating into obscurity to avoid scrutiny. Properties in Willow Creek estates plummeted in value as prospective buyers steered clear of the neighborhood. Some families moved away entirely, unable to bear the stigma left behind. Others stayed, quietly working to rebuild trust and redefine what community truly meant. For us, the settlement money brought both closure and opportunity. We rebuilt the barn, bigger and better this time, using fire-resistant materials to ensure history wouldn't repeat itself. Solar panels lined the roof, powering not only the barn but also our home, a symbol of resilience and sustainability. The bees thrived once again, their hives buzzing with life, producing honey that sold faster than we could bottle it. Customers came from miles around, drawn not just by the quality of the product, but by the story behind it. Yet, despite the victories, scars remained. Trust isn't easily restored, especially when it's been shattered by those who were supposed to protect it. Neighbors who had once shunned us began reaching out tentatively, apologizing or simply checking in. Some relationships healed, others never would. Karen, our former neighbor, sent a note saying she regretted staying silent during the ordeal. It wasn't much, but it was something. A start. Lily started spending more time outdoors again, helping me tend to the garden and collect eggs from the chickens. One evening, as we sat together watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, she turned to me and asked, "Mommy, does this mean we can stay here forever?" Her question caught me off guard, but I smiled and pulled her close. "Yes, sweetheart. This is our home now. No one can take that away from us." As I looked out over the land, the fields, the trees, the rebuilt barn, I realized something important. The fire hadn't destroyed us, it had forged us. Like steel tempered in flames, we emerged stronger, more determined to live authentically, unapologetically. The farm wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a testament to perseverance, a reminder that sometimes you have to lose everything to find your true self. And while the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, I knew one thing for certain. We face it together, standing tall no matter what storms might come. Because in the end, it's not about where you fall, it's about how you rise. Months after the trial ended, life on the farm settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. The scars of the past were still there, charred patches of earth near the rebuilt barn, faded letters from the HOA tucked away in a drawer, but they no longer defined us. Instead, they reminded me of how far we'd come. Every sunrise over the fields carried a sense of renewal, as if the land itself was healing alongside us. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA or another neighbor. It was from a young couple named Sarah and Mark, who had recently moved to Willow Creek Estates. They wrote about their dream of starting a small vegetable garden and keeping chickens for fresh eggs, but admitted feeling uneasy about the HOA's lingering influence. "We heard about your story," they said, and wanted to ask for advice on navigating these kinds of challenges. Reading their words brought back memories of my own struggles, the frustration, the fear, the moments of doubt. But it also filled me with hope. Here were two people looking for guidance, unwilling to let fear dictate their choices. In response, I sent them a jar of honey from our latest harvest, along with a handwritten note. "Rules exist to guide, not govern. Never let fear dictate your choices. Sometimes, the sweetest victories come from standing your ground. When they visited the farm a few weeks later, I showed them around, sharing tips on composting, raising chickens, and dealing with pushback from those who didn't understand. Their gratitude reminded me why fighting back had been worth it, not just for me, but for others like them who deserved the chance to live freely. The neighborhood slowly began to change too. Without the iron grip of the HOA, residents started embracing individuality. Gardens sprouted in unconventional shades. Wind chimes sang in the breeze, and even a few backyard goats appeared here and there. Conversations between neighbors became warmer, less guarded. People realized that harmony didn't mean uniformity. It meant respect. Respect for differences, for boundaries, for the courage it takes to stand up for what you believe in. Daniel noticed the shift as well. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the yard, he leaned back in his chair and sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, "I think this place is finally becoming the community we dreamed of when we first moved here." I smiled, glancing at Lily chasing after the glowing insects, her laughter filling the air. She had grown braver since the fire, more confident in herself and her place in the world. Maybe that was the greatest victory of all, not just saving the farm, but showing her that standing up for what's right can make a difference. Still, the experience left its mark on me. I learned that freedom isn't free. It requires sacrifice, resilience, and sometimes even risk. There will always be people who try to impose their will, who see rules as tools of power rather than frameworks for fairness. But I also learned that communities are stronger when individuals refuse to stay silent. Change doesn't happen because everyone agrees. It happens because someone decides to speak up. As the seasons change, so did the farm. Spring brought blossoms to the fruit trees. Summer painted the fields golden with wheat. Autumn draped everything in fiery hues, and winter wrapped the land in quiet stillness. Through it all, the bees kept buzzing, the chickens kept clucking, and the soil kept giving back what we put into it. Life went on, steady and true. Looking back, I realized the fire hadn't just destroyed. It had transformed. It burned away fear and complacency, leaving behind something stronger, purer. A family unafraid to fight for what mattered. A community learning to embrace diversity. And a woman who once thought she couldn't stand up to authority finding her voice and using it. Because sometimes you have to burn something down to build it back better. And in the ashes, you discover not just what you're made of, but what you're capable of creating.